Psychedelic rock didn't die when the 1960s ended. It mutated. It absorbed prog, blues, jazz, and Eastern music, shed its flower power innocence, and came back in the 1970s as something darker, heavier, and more adventurous than anything the Summer of Love had produced.
Shine like the sun. Shine on you.
The bands on this list weren't chasing a trend. They were pushing past the edges of what rock music was supposed to sound like.
Come on now. I hear you feeling down.
Building soundscapes that had no map and no obvious destination. These are 10 psychedelic rock songs that didn't just reflect the 1970s, they permanently changed what the decade sounded like. 10 Echoes. Echoes runs for 23 minutes and takes up the entire second side of metal, released in 1971. That alone tells you something about where Pink Floyd's ambitions were pointed. The song begins with a single piano note pinging through the mix like a sonar pulse.
Lead you through the line and help me understand the best.
And everything that follows feels like an exploration of whatever that note disturbed in the darkness below. David Gilmour and Roger Waters built the piece collaboratively from dozens of fragments, assembling them in the studio through a process that was more architectural than compositional. There's a midsection that descends into pure abstraction seagull-like sounds, produced by Gilmour's guitar through a wah pedal that still sounds genuinely unsettling 50 years later. Echoes was the rehearsal for the dark side of the moon, the proof that Pink Floyd could sustain a single piece of music across an enormous span without losing the listener's attention. The fact that it has never received the same recognition as their later work is one of the more significant oversights in classic rock history. 9. Space Oddity. Space Oddity predates the 1970s by a year, released in 1969. To coincide with the moon landing, but its cultural life extended so deeply into the following decade that excluding it feels dishonest. The song introduced a character, Major Tom, who became one of rock music's most enduring fictional creations.
Ground control to Major Tom.
Reappearing in Bowie's work across multiple decades. What made it psychedelic wasn't just the subject matter, but the production. Gus Dudgeon and arranger Paul Buckmaster created a sonic environment that genuinely felt like floating, with string arrangements that dissolved the boundary between the interior and the infinite. Bowie delivered the lyric with a detachment that made the isolation of the astronaut feel emotionally real rather than conceptually interesting. The BBC used it during their moon landing coverage and then almost immediately banned it, which tells you everything about how unsettling the song actually was beneath its accessible surface. It remains one of the most perfectly constructed pieces of science fiction ever set to music. 8. Astronomy, Domine. This is the song that started everything. Written by Syd Barrett and recorded for Pink Floyd's debut album in 1967. Astronomy, Domine established the template for psychedelic space rock before the genre had a name. The list of celestial bodies in the lyric wasn't poetry in the conventional sense, it was texture, sound assembled for feel rather than meaning, which was a genuinely radical approach to songwriting at the time. Barrett's guitar work throughout is unpredictable in a way that sounds deliberate rather than accidental, creating tension by refusing to resolve where the listener expects resolution. The song was performed live well into the 1970s, even after Barrett had left the band, a testament to how fundamental it was to everything Pink Floyd built afterward. What makes it remarkable in retrospect is how fully formed it was, a first attempt at something new that immediately achieved what it was reaching for, without the refinement that usually separates early work from mature work. 7. Inagata da Vida. 17 minutes long, built around one of the most recognizable organ riffs in rock history, and featuring a drum solo that lasts for 2.5 minutes in the middle. Inagata da Vida was the song that proved album rock could operate by completely different rules than the pop single. Released in 1968 but defining the early 1970s heavy rock landscape more profoundly than almost anything recorded in that decade, it gave bands permission to extend, to sprawl, to trust that an audience would follow them somewhere that radio would never go. The title was reportedly a slurred version of In the Garden of Eden, which Doug Ingle had been trying to say after consuming substantial quantities of wine. Whether that story is true or not, it perfectly captures the song's relationship to conventional coherence close enough to be recognizable to be accessible, far enough from it to feel genuinely altered. The album it anchored became one of the best-selling records of 1968, demonstrating commercially what the song had already proven artistically, that audiences were hungry for something longer, heavier, and more immersive than the pop single format allowed. Heavy metal, prog rock, and psychedelic blues all trace part of their DNA back to this recording.
6. White Rabbit. Grace Slick wrote White Rabbit in one sitting.
Reportedly after listening to Miles Davis's Sketches of Spain on repeat, and the influence is audible, the song builds with the same slow, inevitable momentum as a bolero, each repetition adding pressure until the final instruction to feed your head arrives like a detonation.
Go chasing rabbits, and you know you're going to fall.
Released in 1967 but burned into the psychedelic rock consciousness for everything that followed, it remains one of the most efficient pieces of countercultural writing ever recorded. The genius of the lyric is its use of Alice in Wonderland as cover. The imagery was innocent enough to get past radio censors while being transparent enough that the intended audience understood exactly what was being discussed. Slick's vocal performance is controlled in a way that makes the eventual explosion more effective, building from a near whisper to something that sounds genuinely authoritative. The song peaked at number 8 on the Billboard Hot 100, which made it both a countercultural statement and a mainstream hit simultaneously, a combination that very few songs from that era managed to pull off without compromising one side of that equation. It changed what a rock vocal performance was allowed to do. 5. Comfortably Numb. The Wall was released in 1979, right at the edge of the decade, and Comfortably Numb arrived as its emotional center, the moment where the album's narrative of isolation and breakdown produced something genuinely beautiful rather than simply devastating. Roger Waters wrote the verses from the perspective of a doctor administering medication to a catatonic rock star, and David Gilmour wrote the choruses, and the tension between those two voices, clinical and transcendent, is what makes the song structurally extraordinary. Gilmour's first guitar solo runs for about a minute, and his second runs longer, and both are routinely cited among the greatest solos in rock history. What separates them from technical showmanship is emotional content. These aren't solos demonstrating what a guitarist can do, they're solos expressing something that the words couldn't reach. The two men were already in the early stages of the creative conflict that would eventually fracture the band permanently, and that tension is audible in the gap between what Waters wrote and what Gilmour played, two people pulling in different directions and producing something extraordinary in the process. Comfortably Numb closes the first half of The Wall and leaves the listener in exactly the state its title describes, which is one of the most complete artistic achievements in the entire psychedelic rock canon. 4. Interstellar Overdrive. Before Roger Waters' conceptual ambitions took over the band's direction, before The Dark Side of the Moon made them the biggest rock act on the planet, Pink Floyd were a live band built around improvisation and pure sonic exploration. Interstellar Overdrive, recorded for their debut album Piper at the Gates of Dawn in 1967, is the document of that version of the band. 9 minutes of structured chaos, anchored by a guitar riff that Syd Barrett reportedly derived from a half-remembered advertising jingle. The improvised sections are genuinely free, without the safety net of a chord progression to return to, which makes the moments of coherence that emerge feel almost accidental. Producer Norman Smith reportedly had almost no idea what to do with what the band was playing, which is possibly the greatest compliment the recording could receive. It established that rock music could treat noise itself as a compositional element, a lesson that reverberated through the entire decade that followed. Before Roger Waters' conceptual ambitions took over the band's direction, before the dark side of the moon made them the biggest rock act on the planet, Pink Floyd were a live band built around improvisation and pure sonic exploration. Interstellar Overdrive, recorded for their debut album Piper at the Gates of Dawn in 1967, is the document of that version of the band. 9 minutes of structured chaos anchored by a guitar riff that Syd Barrett reportedly derived from a half-remembered advertising jingle. The improvised sections are genuinely free without the safety net of a chord progression to return to, which makes the moments of coherence that emerge feel almost accidental. 3. Shine on You Crazy Diamond. Written as a tribute to Syd Barrett, the founder of Pink Floyd, who had collapsed into mental illness and been quietly removed from the band he created, Shine on You Crazy Diamond is one of the most emotionally complex pieces of music the 1970s produced. It opens Wish You Were Here with 9 minutes of instrumental build before a vocal note is sung, which is an almost audacious act of patience that the song completely justifies. Gilmour's guitar tone in the opening section, warm, sustained, slightly mournful, is one of the most recognizable sounds in rock history. Barrett himself reportedly appeared at the recording sessions unannounced, so physically changed that his former bandmates didn't recognize him until he introduced himself, and the song they were recording was about him. That detail transforms the listening experience in a way that can't be undone once you know it. The tribute and the tragedy existed in the same room at the same time, and the music somehow contains both. There is no other recording in rock history where the subject of a song walked into the room while it was being made, and the weight of that coincidence sits permanently inside every note. 2. Whole Lotta Love. Whole Lotta Love opens Led Zeppelin 2 with a guitar riff that sounds like it arrived fully formed from somewhere outside the normal process of songwriting. And then, at the 2-minute mark, it dissolves completely into a psychedelic breakdown that has no real precedent in rock music. Jimmy Page constructed that middle section using studio technology as a compositional tool backwards echo, panning effects, and layered sounds that create a genuinely disorienting experience before the riff returns and the song reassembles itself from the wreckage. Robert Plant's vocal performance is one of the most physically committed recordings in rock history, operating at a sustained intensity that most singers couldn't maintain for half the duration. The song was released in 1969 but defined the heavy psychedelic sound that dominated the first half of the 1970s more completely than almost anything recorded within the decade itself. What Whole Lotta Love demonstrated was that psychedelia and physical intensity weren't opposites, that a song could be simultaneously cerebral and visceral, mind-altering and body-moving, and that the combination was more powerful than either element alone. Page had essentially turned the recording studio into an instrument of its own, and the middle section of this song remains the most compelling evidence of what that approach could produce when taken to its furthest extreme. 10 songs, 1 decade, and a style of music that refused to stay inside any boundary anyone tried to draw around it. Psychedelic rock in the 1970s wasn't a genre so much as a permission to extend, to experiment, to follow a sound wherever it wanted to go, regardless of what the radio expected. The bands on this list took that permission seriously, and the music they made because of it is still changing the way people think about what rock can do. Let us know in the comments which song hits hardest for you, and we'll see you in the next one.